All right, welcome. It is Wednesday, February 23rd. We are running late due to technical difficulties, but here we are, grateful to be together. And we have a fabulous guest today. But before we get rolling, how is our musician of the day, Dr. John Sibley Butler?
I'm doing just fine. I feel like I'm in my house out in San Francisco, but it's
let's get rolling, Johnny. Play that guitar. Let's play that guitar.
All right. To all the girls I've loved before, who traveled in and out my door, so glad they came along. I dedicate this song to all the girls I've loved before.
Brilliant, brilliant. John, how are things? You know, we are in the midst of an ice storm. The market continues to melt down. I tend to think that COVID is under control. We're about to go to war, and maybe not. I have no idea what's going to happen in that front. How are you all feeling? What's your take on how are things doing?
Well, you're right. I got to campus this morning, and it was nice. And I just walked from my other exam. I gave an exam today, and there was an ice storm going on. I think that it's pretty wild. I think the COVID stuff. I think the masks are coming off. The indicators, the number of cases are falling. I think what's happening in Europe is pretty good. You know, I had a president appointment under George W. Bush and went through 9/11 and all of that stuff. I think that as the world moves, you know, I think that the Soviet Union is trying to become, you know, Russia's trying to become. They want a Soviet Union again rather than just Russia. We have to see what Putin does, but it's really, really interesting. But it's a great day in Austin, Texas. Although, as I said before, I feel like I'm in Novato, California, where there's another house where I could go to, and the world is in really, really turmoil. You know, now this is what's interesting. Let me take a little bit more time. We have high inflation. People are buying like hell. On the other hand, we cannot find enough people to find the jobs that we have. So it's almost unprecedented, Andreas. How can we have high inflation on the one hand, people continue to buy on the other hand, and not a lack of jobs? So we are interesting times. You got me?
Somebody's not hearing you. Hear me, Johnny?
I think it's Andreas frozen. So, Llewelyn King, how have you been doing?
Well, I've been doing really well. Thank you very much. I made a wonderful television program yesterday. I hardly got a word in myself. The guest was so loquacious, but it turned out extremely well. Matt, hello, and sorry about the technical problem today. I really do apologize. I'm always a little apprehensive with that. But I thought I had this really souped up, but I must have missed the message that it wasn't Zoom. Anyway, you'll notice that Professor Butler has a very special relationship with the sun. It always shines where he is. It always shines on Austin, Texas, and a little brighter than it shines anywhere else. I have, however, on this program, for many weeks now, said things are going to change because of what is happening in Europe. And they are changing, and they're changing very fast. And it's going to be a while before we realize what a seminal moment this is.
Well, I do agree. I think that the world is very interesting now. And we have a great guest here, Matthew Plante. As I say, I like to say Plante, being a Louisiana boy. But we want to welcome Matthew to our discussion. Matthew, we have a great discussion here about not only the events of the day, but we really want to look at your business model, what you're doing at, I think it's Voltus. Did I pronounce that right? Right. And I think you're located in, are you in San Francisco?
I sure am.
Oh, good. Well, that's a good city. I went to San Jose State every summer and have property up in Novato. Sisters there in Novato, in Marin County. So, Matthew, you want to tell us a little bit about your company and what you're doing in this space as Andre struggles to get back on.
Yeah, sure thing. first of all, it's my pleasure to be here with you two gentlemen. So thank you for inviting us on. It's a real thrill for me to be here, and I could listen to you play guitar all day.
Well, thank you. That's in California in me, you know.
Well, you know, my business partner and I started Voltus 6 years ago, and I love music, but he's actually the guitarist, so he loves to play guitar. If you see him in his office, his home office, he's got guitars all over the walls. He collects them, he plays them, so I'm sure he would love to be here today, but I'm happy to be here today.
Well, that's good.
I'm
As
more
I said,
hopeful than...
Andreas would like to welcome you. I think Andreas is back now, so I'll turn the program back to our wonderful person, Andreas Carvallo.
My apologies. Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
We can, and I want you to know we went on with the program, and I was just asking Matthew about his company.
Oh, brilliant. So Matt, did you get to explain what Voltus is all about?
We were just about to get there, yeah.
Okay, so if you haven't, let me just quickly introduce you. So Matt Plante is the founder and president of Voltus, and Voltus is a pretty interesting company, sort of pushing the envelope of new smart energy management, and he's going to tell us all about it. I happen to believe that you know what Voltus is doing is pretty significant. And it is really the biggest thing, probably in my opinion, is reimagining and retraining how people see energy and think about energy and manage energy. But for those of you that don't know Matt, he has been in this journey for a long time. Currently, he is responsible for Voltus' new market entry and for the development of customer solutions that many leading technology and in market knowledge in straightforward and compelling value propositions to the marketplace. Voltus, according to them, connects distributed energy resources to electricity markets, ushering in the clean energy transition by delivering less expensive, more reliable, and more sustainable electricity and more cash to the customers and partners. Prior to co-founding Voltus, Matt was the CEO of EcoFactor, VP of Sales at Visually, and VP of Sales at Internoc. Matt holds a BA in Economics and Government from Connecticut College and an MBA from the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth University. Welcome, Matt.
It's really my pleasure to be here, Andres. And we're kind of following in your footsteps, so to speak. This business that we run at Voltus is all predicated on the fact that we have a smart grid.
Yep.
And so the work that you did to usher along the smart grid allows folks like us to come and actually build applications on top of that smart grid so that we can move forward our electric grid. It's really incredible. The electric grid hasn't changed much in about 150 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And since we've talked a little bit about Austin, Texas today, which is where you are, let me sort of tell the story of Voltus in terms of Austin, Texas, or Texas.
Yeah.
Our job is to keep on the lights, so to speak. And there's a couple of things happening at the electric grid at the macro level right now. Number one, demand on the electric grid is growing for the first time in a generation.
Mm-hmm.
This is due to a whole host of factors. It's due to, in Texas, it's due to the real opening up of the economy and bringing in business from places like California. It's due to Bitcoin mines and data centers having a real home in Texas due to the business-friendly culture. It's due to the electrification of industry and transportation and the home. And those three things are meaning that the load on the grid is actually increasing. So if you go back 10 or 15 years, Texas's peak demand was about 50,000 megawatts.
Mm-hmm.
Today, Texas's peak demand is 70,000 megawatts. That's a 40% increase in 10 years. That is a larger increase than anywhere else in the country.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, due to climate change. We're trying to move from fossil fuel resources to renewable energy resources. There's good and bad of renewable energy resources. We try to make it all good. The bad has to do with intermittency. We need to move to renewable resources if we're going to stop climate change, but we can't do it unless we have a modern, cost-effective, and reliable electric grid.
Mm-hmm.
And so my company, what we do is we bring what's called distributed energy resources to market. These are resources that the grid can call upon when the grid is stressed. Sometimes that stress on a grid is predictable.
Mm-hmm.
You have an incredibly cold winter day, you have an incredibly hot summer day, and there's not enough capacity to meet the demand. And so what we do is we help our customers actually reduce their consumption of electricity for a period of time. So by pressing a button on my computer, I can make every Walmart in the state of Texas cool at 72 degrees instead of 70 degrees. When you do that over thousands and thousands and thousands of locations, it has the same effect as turning on an additional power plant.
Mm-hmm.
But it brings diversity to the electric grid. One of the problems of Texas's electric grid right now is that there's a single point of failure. When you have certain conditions in Texas, the grid goes down because every asset is like every other asset.
Mm-hmm.
And so when it's incredibly cold, the natural gas plants don't work.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no wind, the wind doesn't blow, and you don't have wind power. And so all you have to have is that combination, incredible cold and no wind, and you get what happened during the storm last February.
Right.
And so what we try to do is we say, look, just like when you buy stocks, you want to diversify your portfolio, and every single stock that you add to that portfolio, regardless of its risk, decreases the risk of the overall portfolio. That's what we do. With every commercial industrial customer that signs up, with every Bitcoin mine that signs up, with every electric vehicle that we can get to stop charging, with every smart thermostat that we bring as a resource to the Texas electric grid, it makes the Texas electric grid all the stronger. I want to talk to you about a little bit of data to hammer home this point.
Mm-hmm.
Utilities and electric grid operators like ERCOT, they have something called a reserve margin. That means, let's say that the demand for electricity is 70,000 megawatts, the way it is in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you have a 15% reserve margin, that means you procure another 10,500 megawatts so that you have total supply of 80,500 megawatts for a grid that has a peak demand of 70,000. You should have enough. Most electric grids have about a 15% reserve margin. Now, according to outages, the amount of time that the grid goes down, there are 7 wholesale electric grids in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
As judged by outages, the amount of time that we lose power, Texas has the least reliable electric grid in the country. That's not just because of IDA, but this is going back 10 years. In 2006, the CEO of ERCOT was fired over a 3-day outage that happened in April when you had a heat wave combined with some power plants going offline for routine maintenance. You had another massive power outage in 2013. Texas has the least reliable electric grid in the country.
Right.
On the other hand, most electric grids in the country have a reserve margin of between 15 and 20%. So if you've got demand for 100,000 units, you've got 120,000 units in supply. 15 to 20%. What do you think Texas's reserve margin is?
Well, now it's much bigger than it was before.
Texas's reserve margin is 55%.
Yeah.
Texas's reserve margin is 55%. It's 3 or 4 times that of most electric grids.
Mhm.
And yet, at the same time that it's got the highest reserve margin, what we think of traditionally as insurance,
Mhm.
that the lights can never go out, at the same time that it has the most insurance, it has the worst reliability. And that's what we at Voltus are trying to fix.
Got it.
The reason those two conditions coexist is because every asset in Texas is exactly the same. And if you have one condition or the combination of two conditions, no wind and hot or cold weather,
Mhm.
big problems. And so what we say is, look, let's bring a new type of resource onto the Texas electric grid so that we can have what Texas deserves: reliable power, affordable power, clean power.
Right.
And so that's what my company aims. That's the problem we're looking to solve.
Yeah.
That's very good, Matt. And I think that everybody appreciates that, given the size of Texas also, when you control for that. But let me ask you a question. You know, you started out by rightly noting that we're running on technology from 100 years ago. And what that means is that we're still pulling levers. What we need is that we have SCADA box, everything is sitting there. But on the other hand, what we do know is tough to get stuff on and off of the grid. And one of the things, even with renewable energy, one of the major things, one of the major questions that we ask is, how do we increase and improve the technology? So when we try to get renewable resources on the grid, it doesn't start a fire. How do you get the renewables back on the grid when you have to do it and do it a lot by pulling levers? My question is, given the technology that we're working in, how efficient can your job be to make sure that grids do not go down, especially, as you said, when they have the same assets? So as you know better than me, what happens in Texas, they got a lot of, quote, mom and pop grids connected to them together and put it under something called ERCOT, which, by the way, Matt, nobody knew what that was. You know, as we like to say, we thought it was something in the refrigerator you go shopping for, an ERCOT, but now everybody knows what it is. So how can the technology that we have now serve what you do today?
Johnny, that is a great question. And when we think of, so there's a lot of positive change happening in Texas to make sure this doesn't happen again. The gentleman in charge now of the Texas Public Utility Commission is a guy by the name of Peter Lake. And Peter Lake doesn't want this to happen anymore because he knows that Texans deserve better. And so he's looking to do the right things. He's looking to upgrade the natural gas generators so that they can actually withstand a cold snap. He's looking to increase the budgets to bring on some of these distributed resources so that Texas has what Alberta, Canada has. Alberta, Canada is the electric grid in the world that looks most like Texas. It's just a smaller scale Texas. But the resource mix is largely the same, except for distributed energy resources. It's islanded the way that Texas is islanded. And so it can't pull in power when it needs to, the way that California has to pull in power from places like Arizona. It's basically on its own. But what Alberta did about 10 years ago was it invested in distributed energy resources. Now my company in Alberta provides more than 2% of Alberta peak demand is provided by distributed energy resources. That is significantly more than what Texas procures now.
Mm-hmm.
And 2% doesn't sound like a whole heck of a lot, but oftentimes that is the difference between blackouts and keeping the power on. And it's definitely the difference very often between power on the wholesale market that costs $50 a megawatt hour, which is probably what it costs right now as we speak, and power prices that get up to $9,000 a megawatt hour, which is what happened last year during the storm.
Right.
And so this issue is really an issue of on the margin, right? When you're on the margin, you're teetering on the margin, all of a sudden prices snap, and it's bad for customers, bad for businesses. The only people that it's good for are power generators.
Yeah.
They make enough money already. So when you bring, when the regulatory policy allows for distributed energy resources, which it does, and the technology exists, nothing gets in your way. Well, Alberta understands that. It put in place the right policy. Texas, I think, is starting to understand that, and it's changing its policy to allow for more DERs because the technology is already there.
Absolutely. Llewelyn?
Matt, can you give us some examples of your interrelationship with a customer? Who, first of all, who is the customer? Who pays you?
The company that pays us is ERCOT. They pay us just the way that they pay a power plant. They say, power plant, you're going to deliver us a resource. Voltus, you're going to deliver us a resource. So they pay us the same way that a power plant gets paid, except instead of turning something on, we simply reduce demand. But the way that we actually deliver a resource to them is by aggregating a bunch of assets, packaging it up and bringing it to them. And our assets are commercial industrial customers who have the ability to reduce their energy consumption from the grid, plus residential customers who have their ability to reduce their energy consumption from the grid. So with a residential customer, we partner with smart thermostat manufacturers. We can press a button and the smart thermostat in your home will change the degree by just a smidge, imperceptible to you. But when you do it over tens of thousands of houses, it actually makes a difference.
Matt, this seems to me to be fairly elementary in a way. Why haven't the grids done it themselves? Why do they need to come to you?
The grid operators have very difficult jobs, and their job is to make sure that they have the resources that enable them to provide safe, reliable, and affordable power. But their job isn't to create the resources. Just the same way that they aren't the ones building power plants, power generators that are building power plants. It's the same thing. They're not the ones who have the capability to talk to a Walmart, a building management system that runs a Walmart store, so that from a computer, you can change the HVAC settings in a Walmart store. They don't have that capability. That's the capability that we have. They don't have the ability from their computers to press a button and an electric arc furnace temporarily shuts down, or a Bitcoin mine stops mining Bitcoins for a period of 20 minutes, which is enough to sort of balance the grid.
How do you
Those are the capabilities that we bring to the table. That allows us to package up hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of distributed energy resources and bring them to the grid, and all of a sudden we've basically created for them a power plant, a very, very reliable, very cost-effective power plant.
How do you recruit participants?
Hold on. A Voltus power plant.
That's right.
I just have one final question. How do you recruit participants? Do you go out with a marketing force and say, you need to join this, become part of Voltus?
Mr. King, this is Matthew Plante calling from Voltus. I'm sure you remember what happened at your facility last year during the Ida storm where you lost power. I sure do. It was a total pain in the neck. My equipment broke down. Caused all sorts of problems. I couldn't get my product out to our customers because we lost power. Mr. King, do you want that to happen again? Well, no, sir. Great. How about if I pay you to help stop that from happening? Come again? That's right. How about I pay you to stop that from happening again? Well, tell me how that works. Mr. King, I'm going to help you find an ability to reduce your energy consumption from the grid when the grid most needs it. You're going to get paid year round, regardless of whether I call you. I'm going to call on thousands of other customers. And when you all reduce the grid, your demand of electricity from the grid is going to be reliable. That sounds fantastic. Great. Thank you very much. That's how we do it. We literally call into energy decision makers at commercial and industrial facilities. We present them with a very straightforward, simple value proposition. There's no risk to them.
Right.
And they sign up.
Gotcha.
So Matt, real quick, are you able to make the argument? Oh, did we lose Matt? We did. Where's Matt?
Sorry, I'm back.
Oh, your camera is off, Matt, for some reason. No worries. No worries. These things happen. So my question was, Matt, so everybody knows that there is a real-time wholesale market on megawatt hours that has a price, and that price ranges from 0 to 9,000. On average, it's around $20 or $30 most of the year during peak times, and sort of when hot demand in the winter, the summer happens, it hobbles up in the 50s or 60s or 80s. It depends on the node, all that. My question to you is, does the opposite, what you sell, the Voltus power plant, which I would call a negawatt, the opposite of a megawatt, is that negawatt, does it have the same market value that the megawatt does? And if not, how do we get there?
So the cost of blackouts and brownouts is incredibly significant. When California has its wildfires and the utilities here have to do public safety power shutoffs, or when Texas has a storm, or when there's an ice storm or a polar vortex up in Michigan, the economic loss from a blackout is incredibly significant. 200 people, I think, died in Texas last year as a result of the storm and losing power. And it's a real, I think Texas is a really interesting case study for this question, Andres, because as you know, Texas has an energy-only market, meaning they don't pay for capacity the way that every other United States-based wholesale energy market does. And you're getting at a philosophical question. The reason I brought up Alberta and said Alberta is most similar to Texas, because Alberta also has an energy-only market. 2 years ago, Alberta passed some legislation that was going to have it enact a capacity program, and that was turned down. And so they remain with Texas as the markets that have energy-only markets. But energy-only markets, I think we've seen some of the limitations of them. And I think the capacity markets, I would say the same thing about them. When we're so dogmatic about policy, it tends not to lead to the best outcomes, because these dogmatic ways of thinking lead us to suboptimal outcomes.
Right.
The idealistic is different than reality. And so what we want to do is help Texas maintain what's important to it. It's independence, frankly, from the rest of the grid. They are not governed by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission the way that each other wholesale market in the United States is. That's important to them. We also want them to maintain their cost, their reliability. And so I just think there's a price that you have to pay if you want the power to stay on.
So basically, because I want the audience to understand this, you're telling me that negawatts don't have the same value of megawatts.
We don't produce a megawatt of electricity every hour of the year. We produce a megawatt when the grid really and truly needs it.
Right.
If you look at the resources that could do what we do, we are far cheaper than any competing resource to provide the benefits that we provide.
Right.
So peaking power plants, for example, are paid in order to deliver some of the same services that we deliver.
Right.
PJM, the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland market, the largest electric grid in the world, conducted a study to see whether the grid balancing services that we provide are done more reliably by traditional power plants or by virtual power plants, by megawatts, as you said. Virtual power plants more reliably deliver grid balancing services than peaking power plants do. That's something that's hard for the public to understand because the perception is that it's a physical asset. It can turn on. The fact of the matter is, yes, it's a physical asset. It doesn't always turn on. And the failure rate of centrally located single point of failure resources is much, much, much higher than what we are bringing to the market, which is a decentralized, distributed, many point of failure resource. So we are bringing thousands of resources into the market instead of one resource.
Right.
So if hundreds of those resources fail, we are still bringing the majority of our resource. Whereas with peaking power plants, one failure and you get nothing. And
Right.
that happens a lot.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, let me ask you this in that same tradition, talking about distributed resources. One of the greatest things that has develop is the development of people doing microgrids. And I send my microgrid people to Andreas to talk about it, whether or not they're talking about putting it on an 18-wheeler, whether or not they're talking about putting it in communities. There's a lot of talk about microgrids. So your business model would be then to also roll up the microgrids, I'm guessing. Let us say that they begin to be a plethora of them around the state of Texas and America. So you see your business model as rounding up the microgrids. And like you say, when electricity is produced, you use it. You're really difficult storing it in batteries. So how do you see microgrids and the development of many people wanting to do microgrids? That is a return to the 1920s. How do you see the development of microgrids in your business model?
John, they're a small part of the picture here. And so right now, microgrids are a tiny, tiny fraction of what happens on an electric grid. We're still not at the point where it makes a dent in what happens on an electric grid. But customers are affected by the reliability of the grid, and they are being told by senior management to invest in resiliency so that the increasing interruptions that you can argue whether they're caused by climate change. My take is there is. Other people's take is that they're not. It doesn't matter. The facts are the facts. There are more interruptions on the electric grid now than there ever have been. The Wall Street Journal had an article this week with some really great data about the number of hours of interruptions we have in the electric grid now compared to 20 years ago. It's significantly more, and the problem continues to get worse, right? So you're having to invest in resiliency, and that's why some people are investing in microgrids. What we want to do is make the entire electric grid reliable. We don't want to have to rely on microgrids. We just want to create a decentralized grid that works for everybody. Got to have three things, right? We want it to be decarbonized. It's also got to be affordable, and it's got to be reliable.
You know, we had a great discussion, Matt, at Digital 360 on my panel about the significance when my house goes out where the aggregate goes away. So what we asked in San Marcos was, to what extent is there a market, let's say, of wealthy people who are interested in microgrids, and that market grows to be substantially. That is, take away the aggregate, and the question is there a market of wealthy people who are willing to pay anything, and Andreas can tell us about those people who do this, to make sure that their lights do not go out. So why should they depend on the larger grid technology? And it can be faulty, and they could have a situation with microgrids, and they never have to experience what the masses experience. It's the analog of flying in a private plane. So if I have private transportation and I can do it, why should I worry about what's happening on commercial flights? My question is, as it was in San Marcos, do you think there's a market of people who are willing to pay anything? As long as my lights comes on, whether it's a microgrid or the larger grid, it doesn't matter. Can I develop a market and create a $500 million company around people who you guarantee people with microgrids in their homes that the electricity would never go off?
The answer is yes, right? So, you know, Schneider Electric and Siemens, and there are many companies investing in the microgrid space, and there's a market for it, right? There's a reason that hundreds of millions of dollars are being poured into the space. It's still a very, very, very small percentage of the market. What we want to do is we want wholesale grid operators to have the resources they need in order to do their jobs. 30 years ago, they did, John. Today, they increasingly don't. And what we want to say is we believe in wholesale markets. They need some reform to change with the times. We haven't changed much in 150 years. They need some reform, but we believe in wholesale markets. We just want to give them the resources to do their job, to keep the lights on, to do it in a safe and reliable way, in an affordable way. And that's what we're bringing to market. That's what's missing right now.
Yes.
So if you do that, then the microgrids become sort of marginalized. Nobody has a microgrid if the big grid works, right? But when the big grid stops working the way that it has always worked, and we've always taken it for granted, right? It has led to our way of life, our quality of life. It's all because of the electric grid. It's really incredible. The correlation across the world between reliable, affordable power and quality of life is very, very strong.
So let me add something to that thought process. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, and you've been doing this, and you guys are super experts on all this liquidity markets and the ability for the reserves and the demand response, monetization. So I'm thinking about something that, you know, I've been stitching in my mind for a long time on how to bootstrap this, because at some point the EVs and the solar panels will have significant critical mass, perhaps to the same value in net megawatts that the central production does. And in synchronizing a grid that has so much distributed generation is going to be super difficult, which will make the need for, managing islanding and managing synchronization by balancing the demand and the supply at each node a reality. So what about, is it possible, or does any market, maybe Australia, maybe, the UK, we haven't talked about what's going on outside the US, but is it possible to think that the megawatt market should live in a separate trading market that is connected to the ERCOT wholesale trading market in the case of Texas? But it's really about the options market, sort of like this Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and people buying puts and calls on the fact that certain stocks are going to go up or down. Could that do you see that possibility? Do you see the possibility of the megawatt market, on steroids, related to every EV connected to the grid, related to every solar panel connected to the grid, to the smart appliances, that somehow that megawatt, which in my opinion has a value, could have its own market that trades separately? What do you think of that?
I think that's a really interesting idea, Andres. And you mentioned Australia, and I think that's a great market because they're probably 10 years ahead of us in terms of what their grid looks like versus where ours is going. we've always viewed our resources as competing with traditional generation,
Mm-hmm.
and it's almost like we don't want to be treated differently. We simply want a level playing field. We just want an opportunity to compete. What we've been saying all along is we will compete. We don't want special treatment. We don't want subsidies. We don't want special treatment. We have a resource that will outcompete the traditional resource. And so don't stick me in a bucket for my type. I'm going to fight you on your own terms.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, then the electric grid can say, hey, we have a bucket of resources to choose from, and they're going to pick the ones that are actually delivering value to you. I don't want the right to provide my services simply because I'm Voltus, or simply because I'm digitized, or simply because I'm modern, or simply because I'm decentralized. That doesn't give me the right to actually provide a service to a grid. I should only be able to provide a service to my grid if I'm doing it as reliably for less money.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we want. And so that's what we're all about.
I hear you. Llewelyn.
Yes, can I inquire, what is your penetration outside of Texas, where the dynamic is somewhat different? Is your customer the ISO, or is it the utility?
In the wholesale markets, it's the ISO, but we also work with utilities in regulated territories for very similar reasons. And we do deals with utilities where they call upon us a certain number of hours a year, and we give them a certain number of megawatts of load reduction.
Is there a percentage? You mentioned 2%. Is that what you're aiming for? Is it 2% of distributed energy you can bring to a grid?
Yeah, it's a really interesting, Llewelyn. So 10 years ago, we always thought that 10% was the cap. We can provide 10% of the peak demand of a region. But things are changing with information technology and IoT and electric vehicles. We actually think the penetration rate now is significantly higher than 10%. And I think over the next 15 years, you'll have 25% of a region's resources being provided by distributed energy resources.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Interesting, very interesting.
Real quick, Matt, fire hose questions here real quick. What's your take on EVs and the fact that 500,000 charging stations and potentially, several million of EVs will be in the market in the next 2 years? What is that going to do to the grid, and what does that mean for me to need to have a relationship with Voltus? Regardless of who I am, I could be a commercial industrial customer. How do I get protected from the fact that those devices are going to disrupt the grid?
Yeah, so I think they're going to, that dynamic that you're explaining means that we simply have to have more resources than we have today to provide power in a reliable, affordable way. And so Chairman Neil Chatterjee of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission calls distributed energy resources the assets that are hiding in plain sight in our homes. And he means this, that if you own an electric vehicle, if you own a Ford 150 Lightning, which is what I want, that can be an actual resource to the grid.
Right.
And so I think when you look at the numbers and the number of megawatts from the combined capacity of lithium-ion batteries from electric vehicles, there's only one answer. They are going to be a strain on the grid, and they are going to be a resource to the grid.
Right.
Yeah, well, Matt.
Speaking on the F-150 Lightning, which I put a deposit for one, what's your take on the disruption of the V2X since you can run your house? Do you see the use case that I see, which is my use case? I'm gonna go to work. I'll charge my truck at work,
and I'll come home and run the whole house from home, and I'm never going to pay electricity as a retail customer anymore.
It's going to happen.
Good.
Yeah, Matt.
We agree. We agree. Real quick, Matt, are miners some of your customers on companies that want to get paid by the ISOs?
Yeah, 35% of our customers over the last several months have been miners, and so we are doing a tremendous amount of work with those. Mhm.
That's huge.
Yep.
Well, Matt, this is wonderful. Let me ask you this: when you look
Not
at
35% of our customer base, Andres, just to clarify, but
Yeah.
the recent work we've done over the last couple of months, yeah, there's a significant
Yeah.
portion of miners. So
They're emerging. You know, every day there's a new miner company. So.
it's
well, Matt, let me ask you this. I'll just feed into this conversation. When we look at grid modernization, standardization that's coming out of Washington, all the research that's being done by EPRI, the fact that electric vehicles are coming on. So there are lots of trends here. And also many private firms are starting their own version of grid modernization. So there's a lot of trends here. And I'm going to pretend that you're an insurance company and that you have to underwrite the grid. In this case, you're the insurance company for one big grid. My question is, if you look at what I call the standardization of the grid that's coming out of Washington, D.C., and then it goes through EPRI, and then it comes on to us, and then it sits on the shelf. Okay. So my question is, how do you look at that and plan for the future when there's so much going on grid modernization? It looks like every private firm is getting into it, as you guys have just said. Our Ford Motor Company is into it. And certainly we know that the electric car company that is here, Tesla, is into it, as he wants to put a power plant in everybody's house and pay for electricity, have me pay him and not the state. How do you plan for all of the trends as an underwriter, the unknown trend, the uncertainty, and as we move toward what I call the standardization, if you will, of the grid through EPRI and the United States government?
well, I think we can look to other places to see, who has gone through these challenges before and how they handled them, and where can we look for guidance in terms of how to handle this. Let's get back to core principles, though. What are we really trying to accomplish? And what's the best way to accomplish those things? And the thing I like about our business, we sit here with just about 2,500 megawatts of capacity that we bring to grids. And, a big peaking power plant is 300 megawatts or so. So we're about 8 peaking power plants. There's a big portion of our business that is going to take the penetration rate from 2 or 5% to 25%. And a lot of that is looking forward of the changes that can happen in the next 10 years. But at 2,500 megawatts, we're delivering significant value to a grid now. And so I like that part of our business, which is certainly a lot of the growth is going to come from the changes that we're seeing. But even if the grid doesn't actually evolve in some of the ways we've been discussing, there's still the ability to add tremendous value so that IDA and the blackouts that happen as a result of IDA don't need to happen anymore. I don't know if that answered your question very well, but
yeah, I think so, because what we're saying is that there's so much technology. It's like I was a major consultant for a major insurance company. My question is, what happens when cars stop bumping into each other? What happens when your auto goes down? And then we'll stop bumping into each other as the new technology increases. So even with the application of the warning light on your car now, that when a car is near in the blind area, that has really decreased collisions. And at one time, cars would stop bumping into each other. And I think as you are in one of the most exciting spots to be in America, right, and the world,
So,
As
quick,
we like to say, nobody's bringing their own grid or their electricity to Texas or to any other place. And as we move forward with the Internet of Things, and you're talking about, you know, plugging up electric cars, what about the Internet of Things, where there'll be billions of people getting on this Internet? And then what about, you know, what about all of the places where computers are, you know, where we store the cloud, is everybody goes to the cloud. We just have to figure out a way that the grid does not have to go down. It's uncertainty, and the backup stuff is always, the underwriting plan is always good. So that was a good answer.
Matt, real quick, other markets have figured out that in order to empower and enable what you do on steroids, there's a need for a new figure called the distribution system operator. Some people would argue, and have argued in Texas, that ERCOT is both an ISO and a DSO, and is uniquely qualified to do that better than anybody else because it has all the functions of a market, from balancing authority to frequency regulation and wholesale trading and all of the above. And ERCOT today dispatches automatically up, you know, anything above 10 megawatts. Is that correct?
Yes.
Anything below 10 megawatts, what is the rule on that?
I'm not sure exactly.
Okay. But in theory, there's a filing that was just done at ERCOT. One of our consulting friends told us about this. They're lobbying for the battery transformation of Texas, and they're trying to convince ERCOT that an asset that produces 100 kilowatt hours a month should be dispatchable by ERCOT. So the question to you is the following. Do you see the need for a DSO across the nation, or is Voltus a DSO by default? What's going to happen? What do you think is going to happen?
I think these things move slowly.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't expect anytime soon for there to be significant structural changes as to how ISOs work. There are plenty of people who disagree with me. There are even people within Voltus who disagree with me and think that we're going to move to, you know, one uniform, standardized wholesale grid across all of the United States. It sure would bring down costs. It sure would increase reliability. I don't think there's any doubt about that, but I just think politically it's probably a pipe dream.
Right.
I don't know. My job, it's a really interesting question, Andres. It's sort of like our job is to be prepared regardless of the structure.
Mm-hmm.
As long as we're delivering a service to the grid that's really valued, we're going to be in a good position to do that. John,
Yeah.
I can't believe you brought up the analogy of the car with the alarm that goes off when you're backing up and you get too close, because those aren't my words, but those are the words of the woman who runs the Alberta electric system. And she said to my company, we had her on as a guest speaker at our all hands call, and she said to us, before you guys came along, well, actually, the best analogy that I can give you is that now when I'm running my electric grid, I feel like I'm driving in a car that's going to protect me, and you guys are that alarm that I can call and reliably know that things are okay. And if every Voltus went away, it would be like driving a rental car that doesn't have that, and all of a sudden you take for granted that the grid is as reliable as it once was.
Right.
And so I thought that was a really neat analogy.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Maybe you should have me next time to speak, since I was for him.
Let's do it. But only if you play the guitar for a little bit longer than you do.
Oh, I can do that too. No, I think what I said, what we do is look across industry. And I do believe, Matt, that it would be across the United States one day. I think the grid is where computers were 50 years ago. And I think it will be standardized. I think that we'll be able to be hacked. I think what will happen in my vision is that when something goes wrong in New York City, then you could get on the entire grid and help New York out with the energy from California. And I do believe that it would have to be secure. I think it'd be just like a Microsoft and my computer. And I think there would be some standardization. I think it's going to be from coast to coast. Now, and I think as we go toward that way, we really need companies like yours to keep us from bumping into things. And what people haven't realized in the past is that we do everything on the signal and the noise. That is, how can we predict things that go bad? We know that every time there's an airplane crash, we learn from that crash. I mean, that industry has collected every bit of data when something goes wrong. And we need to do that with the grid. We need to create the analog of the grid with how we operate, say, our airline industry. So I think going forward, the country will need an underwriter. I think going forward, every city and every region will have an underwriter. So in terms of your business model, I would say that think about the grid being all connected throughout the world, and throughout America, much like Microsoft, and you are the underwriter. And by the way, that's just a little consulting advice, and I usually charge for that, but since you're a good man, I'm not going to charge you. I couldn't say that with a straight face. Okay.
I love the analogy. I think it's really smart thinking.
Okay.
Llewelyn?
I think it's very smart thinking, but I don't think we're going to see it in a very long time because of regional interests, state interests, vested interests. So we're going to have to use the grid we have and use companies. And I think it's a very interesting discussion today, very exciting. I think what Matt is doing makes an awful lot of sense. And it's I think DER is going to be a very important part. I'm wondering, how are you doing with ISOs outside of Texas? Texas and Alberta are isolated systems, peculiar unto themselves. This is not true of PJM or Southwest Power Pool or California ISO, where indeed they are looking to extend their reach into neighboring regions, both to be able to draw on power from those regions and to sell power to those regions. I do think, for example, we're going to see, probably not as completely as some would like to have it, but we're going to see more east-west transmission or west-east transmission, etc. And we're all waiting for some sort of technological breakthrough that is going to improve the efficiency of transmission. Maybe more direct current lines. It may be something quite different. We don't know. That's the thing about technology. But how are you doing outside of Texas and Alberta?
Well, I'm glad you asked. California probably needs our resources more than any other area, and we have hundreds of megawatts here in California. MISO has historically had the most reliable electric grid, and that is changing significantly due to a change in resource mix and other things that are happening there. And they're going to move to a seasonal capacity construct where they procure resources seasonally. That market needs significant reform. SPP has been our largest growth over the last 12 months, Llewelyn, and a lot of the miners that we're helping, many of them are coming into Texas, but many of them are also going into SPP in places like Oklahoma. Oklahoma is making a real push to challenge Texas to be, and New York State, to be the Bitcoin capital of the world. PJM is the region that kicked all this off in 2005 when they started what they call their reliability pricing model. They're the one that got this whole thing started, and so that is the largest market for distributed energy resources right now in the United States. And New York is doing, what they call REV, and between the incredibly expensive New York City market, where we work with commercial real estate players, all of whom are trying to save costs and reduce their carbon footprint due to both demand from their tenants and things like local law 97. New York is a big market for what we do. So Each of these regions we operate in differently. We provide slightly different products with the same goal in mind, to strengthen the reliability of the electric grid. So it makes it dynamic. It makes it fun. It at times, of course, is frustrating because you have to operate slightly differently and build different software for each of these regions. But that's why we exist.
The grid realities are somewhat the same all over the world. Do you have operations outside of the U.S.?
We have to date been in North America, and in the last in 2022 we will move into 2 countries outside of North America.
Very good, very interesting. I think you've got a great business. I really do. It's at least very appealing to me. Maybe it's because I think I understand it. I'm not sure.
Thank you very much. We like to think so too, and I think what's most important, Llewelyn, is that for the first time, I've been in this space for all of my working career, 23, 24 years, but for the first time since I've been working, I do think that the energy grid and climate-based solutions writ large are attracting the best and the brightest. That hasn't happened before. And so I
think it's happened in a very long time. There was
maybe that's true.
When nuclear came in, there was a sudden improvement in the if I can say this, in the quality of the intake. But that is over, and we sort of I think the Depression had a very large effect on utility recruiting. The people who wanted very safe careers went to work for utilities, not people who wanted dynamic, exciting careers. That was somewhat reversed with nuclear, but as nuclear faded, that impetus for talent watered down. But now, when energy is extremely exciting, electricity is the cutting edge of that excitement, I think you're quite right. This is an extraordinary time.
That's a fantastic point. That's ultimately what's going to solve this problem, right? With the amount of capital coming into the space combined with the best and the brightest, we're going to create all the solutions we need to solve this problem and give us the electric grid that we deserve.
Of course, up to this point in time, all the solutions have come from Andres.
You guys are so funny. Hey, let me take a moment and share my screen real quick, because I want to say thank you to our sponsors. So our annual conference, Matt, we need to have you guys come and speak. And be part of this in September. It's coming up. This is the logos that sponsor and keynoted and spoke last year. And so, we will be honored to add the Voltus logos to our relationships. We are building these 9 living labs at Texas State CIEDAR Consortium. And I want to say thank you to Texas State for sponsoring the Digital RoundTable. So real quick, Matt, tell us about your IPO. I know that you cannot say much about it other than you filed, but this seems to be a huge milestone for you all. Any comments that you can make about the milestone?
Yeah, it's my wife tried to get me to celebrate, but it's really just a means to an end. We want to do some good, and you need capital to do some good, and this is a great way for us to get some capital to do some good. So it's certainly a big milestone in the company's journey. We really view our impact by whether we're having an effect. Can we actually point to California and say, hey, despite the wildfires, we kept the power on. Despite the polar vortexes, despite the ice storms, we kept the power on. If we're able to actually bring the scale of resources we think we can to have that effect, that'll be what really gets us to be excited. And the IPO is a way for us to access capital so that we can do that in an efficient manner.
Yeah.
We have an amazing team of incredibly committed incredibly talented people. I just feel so fortunate and humbled to be able to work with them every day.
Mhm.
And the opportunity to go public, sheds a little bit of light on us, which I think helps us recruit, which is the most important thing for us right
Sure.
now. So there are a couple of good reasons to do it.
Well, I thank you for being with us today, and we want to close. Gentlemen, any parting thoughts for Matt?
Yeah, more power to you, Matt. I think you're doing something really exciting, interesting, and of huge value to any electric system, and therefore to the people who live there.
Man, I think it's wonderful. Keep your metrics together. Keep your measurements together so you can show people what you're doing as you move toward the future.
Absolutely.
I thank you, Matt, for your time. And this recording will be available. You'll be able to share this with folks, and it'll go into our Digital RoundTable webpage. And thank you for having us and in your day today. And John, where's that guitar?
Oh, yeah.
Let's run away.
Take the ribbon from your hair. Shake it loose and let it fall. We'll live by your side like the shadows on the wall. Yesterday is dead and gone, and tomorrow's out of sight. All I'm asking is your time. Help me make it through the night.
All right.
Bravo!
Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to stop recording now.